And welcome to Power Play on this Tuesday evening. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa. Tonight, value for money.
This new government is committed to making the best use of all taxpayers' dollars.
A chronicle of liberal incompetence and an orgy of liberal waste.
Remember ArriveCan, the $80,000 app that ballooned into a $60 million spending scandal? The government's watchdog has a new report that calls out the government for not following its own rules when it awards contracts with your money. The Auditor General will be here live in moments to tell us more. Then, Donald Trump defends sending the National Guard to California.
If we didn't get involved, right now, Los Angeles would be burning.
The U.S. president doubles down on his deployment of the National Guard and U.S. Marines against protesters in Los Angeles, advocating against an immigration crackdown he's ordered in that city. What's behind Trump's home soil military escalation? His former national security advisor, John Bolton, will join us in just a little bit, and I'll ask him. Plus, friends or foes?
There is a law enforcement to law enforcement dialogue that is occurring between those two countries.
Prime Minister Mark Carney invites leaders of India and Saudi Arabia to the G7 summit he's leading next week in Banff. Our front bench is set to dig into the political and diplomatic calculations behind the growing and controversial guest list. That's coming up a little bit later on in our program. First, though,
I thank the Auditor General for her service. I note that GC strategy has been prohibited from government contracts for 7 years, and it's that standard, the minimum. As a member of Canada's new government and a new member of Parliament, we will uphold higher standards, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister Mark Carney on the defense there after a damning report from the government's top watchdog, the Auditor General, who's now completed a big investigation into 9 years of contracts awarded to the company contracted to develop the ArriveCan app. Remember that? It's a COVID-era, much maligned border control app with a price tag that ballooned from $80,000 to almost $60 million. The AG found that the company received 106 contracts from 2015 to 2024. $65 million was paid out to the company with a max value on those contracts, a maximum value of $90 million. The watchdog also found issues with procurement rules, a lack of evidence all work had been completed, and a failure to ensure everyone working had obtained security clearance. Notably, the Auditor General made no recommendations in the report, saying that the government doesn't need more procurement rules. They just need to follow the ones in place. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre responded outside the House. Have a listen.
Today's Auditor General's report, which I have today in my hands, today's Auditor General's reports, I should say, are a chronicle of liberal incompetence and an orgy of liberal waste. We're calling on the government to get our money back. They need to go to GC Strategies and get our money back so taxpayers can be made whole.
For more on all of this, we're joined live in studio by the Auditor General herself, Karen Hogan. Hi, Ms. Hogan. Good to have you back here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for making the time. If I could, I want to start, just because it's been a while since all of this happened at the beginning, which is around ArriveCan and primarily GC Strategies. So the contracts to GC Strategies that you largely investigated. What is GC Strategies and why was it contracted by the government?
So GC Strategies is an IT staffing company. So they don't do IT work themselves. They find resources to carry out the work that the government would like to have done. So they were the main contractor who was tasked with developing the ArriveCan app. And following that audit report, the House of Commons passed a unanimous motion asking me to go look at all contracts issued by the public service to them over a period of almost a decade. And what I found was what I expected to find. If you remember, after ArriveCan, I issued a report on professional services linked to the firm McKinsey. And at that time, I said I had no reason to believe that the lack of following procurement rules was solely linked to one vendor. And this audit is just confirming that. We have another 31 federal organizations in this audit with contracts with GC Strategies. And what we found is they often ignored or disregarded procurement rules that were in place meant to ensure fairness, transparency, and good value for money.
So in layman's terms, when you say that essentially the rules exist, but there's evidence now more widespread that they weren't being followed, like what are some examples of things that they didn't do that they should have?
So I'll give you two examples. One is that if they identify that security requirements are needed, that resources need to have a certain level of security clearance because they might have access to sensitive information or sensitive IT systems, that someone responsible to manage that contract should make sure that the resource has a security clearance in place. We saw that about half of the contracts we looked at needed security clearances, but we found in 21% of the files that there was no evidence on file that they had checked security clearances. So that puts government information and systems at risk. The second example I would give is that almost 94% of the contracts required timesheets to demonstrate who had worked and how long they had worked. And we found that in almost 70% of the case, they didn't gather that evidence that they needed. So they accepted poor documentation or no documentation to really demonstrate who had done what work, and yet they authorized payments. And that just leaves you in a place where you question whether good value for money was actually received.
And it's not the first time you're raising that question or providing some context for an answer. Do you have a sense of why? Like, why is there such disregard for the rules?
So it's a question I asked myself back during the first work on professional services, and that's why I decided not to issue recommendations here today. I don't believe that the government needs more procurement rules. I think they need to take a step back and make sure that all the rules that are in place are well understood and then that they are being applied. But I also recommend that the government look at whether they could simplify things. Over the years, my office has issued lots of recommendations on procurement. There's the procurement ombuds, there's internal audit groups across the federal public service, and we just keep adding to those rules. And I think it's time to say, are there too many, and can we speed up procurement? And is that a reason that we're seeing the kind of behavior that we're seeing?
Have you seen any evidence that the government, is taking seriously the problem as you lay it out, insofar as there is an issue in the public service where these rules are being disregarded? Is the government, in your view, doing enough to counter that?
So each and every department has to be accountable and responsible for the procurement decisions they make. But Public Service and Procurement Canada, who is sort of the procurement specialist for the government, took action right after ArriveCan and McKinsey. But they added a few more rules and a few more steps. And that's why I think it's time to sort of take that step back and say, why are we seeing the behavior that we're seeing? Are there too many rules so people don't understand or know that they all exist? Or in order to serve Canadians better, they're circumventing some of them to speed up the process. What is that root cause? And then you can really make sure that you have the right rules in place.
Do you have any sense if the people who are skirting the rules feel there are consequences to doing so?
So the individuals we talked to throughout the audit on GC strategies, at times they were surprised that there was something that they hadn't done, or they felt that they did it and just didn't go far enough. The consequences are that when you're given a delegation of authority, especially one where you're allowed to authorize the spending of public funds, if you're not following those rules, the department can take that delegation away and then give you proper training before they give it back. So I'd expect to see that there'll just be a reminder about the basics, what rules are there and why they should be followed.
Should there be some political accountability? I found it interesting today that the primary response from the government was essentially like, we're not doing business anymore with this one company, and we've put a 7-year kind of hold or ban on doing so. Like, does there need to be, and I've interviewed multiple ministers as your reports came out who were in those positions of authority at the time, who responded to me that they were unaware that all of this was going on until there was reporting on it or your own investigation. Like, do people in political positions need to ask more questions about value for money? Like, is there any evidence that they have been?
Well, ministers are typically not involved in day-to-day procurement transactions, right? We did see a minister involved back in the work that we did on McKinsey, but because it was such a large dollar value and the procurement rules required a minister to be involved. So I wouldn't expect that they would know about day-to-day transactions. I would expect that they'll ask about value for money because that's one of the foundations for having all of these rules in place. I think that this is about just reminding everyone in the public service why the rules exist, because we didn't look at the work of a vendor. And I have no reason to believe that the lack of following the rules is linked to a specific vendor. This is really about the public service. This audit had 31 federal organizations. The first audit on professional services had 20. So this is a lot of federal organizations just not applying the rules that exist.
I guess on this one subject, then I conclude by asking, like, how widespread when it comes to outsourcing do you anticipate at this juncture the not following the rules might be? And I ask because even though the government had promised last year to decrease spending in that area, it actually ended up increasing, I believe, according to the Globe and Mail's analysis, by 13%. And I'm asking, like, also against the backdrop of, like, Canadians who are tapped out, who keep handing money over to the government and want to make sure that there's value. It's not a bad thing, but want to make sure that there's value for what their hard-earned money pays for.
Many of the public servants that we interviewed throughout this audit said to us that the services were received, the final goods were there, but they had no evidence for it. And that's why it makes it really hard for us to conclude whether value for money was achieved. And the procurement rules are clear in this respect. Right? Document why you made the decisions that you make. Show that you made the best possible decision, that this is the best price, that you went to get a good competitive price, and then demonstrate that you received what you contracted for. Those are really foundational elements to demonstrate value for money, and I think the public service just needs to go back to the basics.
So another big report you did today was on F-35. So that is, for everyone watching, many of whom are familiar with this, the fighter jets that we are in the process, sort of procuring to replace an aging fleet of CF-18s. There's a pause right now because it's under review, given what's going on with the United States. But you looked at the costs that have increased for F-35s. I thought the most interesting thing you found, though, was around our own readiness. When we do, or if we do end up procuring them, to actually man them, to pilot them, to house them. What did you find there?
So that was the point of our audit, actually, was to see if national defense was on the right track to be ready to receive the fleet of new fighter jets and to transition. And we found a few things. We found that the facilities that are going to be needed for these new aircraft are about 3 years behind schedule. And so there's a need for interim facilities because the first aircraft should arrive in Canada in 2028. So that's going to increase the costs even more than the costs that are in our report. But a bigger concern, no matter what plane the government purchases, is to have qualified pilots. And this is something we flagged back in 2018 when we did work on CF-18s. And we're finding that same risk again here. The National Defense has a plan, but their plan projects that they will not have enough qualified pilots. And really, that's something they need to address right now.
Has any of that been mitigated since 2018 when you first identified it as a problem?
Well, I think it'll be a different problem. Right now, you're going to need pilots who can fly both aircraft or enough trained pilots for CF-18s and CF-35. So it's about upskilling existing pilots and then hiring new pilots and making sure that they're trained on that aircraft. So it's a slightly different risk, but still the same risk of making sure that you can have a big fleet, but you need the pilots and you need the trained technicians to take care of that fleet.
Did you see any evidence of that being the case?
Well, there is this plan, as I said, but currently the plan is projecting that there will be a gap in qualified pilots. And that's one of the other findings that we had, was that risk management here really seems to be more reactive. When a risk occurs, a plan's put in place to try and deal with it, instead of being more proactive and mitigating and get ahead of those risks.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Ms. Hogan, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Karen Hogan is the Auditor General. The Defense Minister was, in fact, asked about the Auditor General's report on F-35s. Here is what David McGuinty said.
I've just come back from a NATO meeting where I believe 30 of the 32 NATO partners are participating in the F-35 program. They have participated since the beginning, some of whom have had significant industrial benefits. We've had our share of those. I think right now what we're seeing as we've looked at the Auditor General's report, a number of factors are at play here. And all of our NATO partners are affected by these factors. One was inflation. Obviously, we've seen an inflationary pressure on materials, logistical chains, supplies, construction, engineering. The second was, of course, the pandemic.
The opposition went very hard on the government on these reports today in question period. We will unpack that with our front bench a little bit later on. Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie will join me. First, though, after a short break, tensions are escalating in California after President Trump deployed thousands of National Guard troops to Los Angeles to confront protesters over immigration raids. What is motivating the president? Plus, Could a new trade deal between Canada and the U.S. be imminent? Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, is my guest after the break.
Last night was terrible. The night before that was terrible. We have, as you've seen, it was on most of your networks, people with big, heavy hammers pounding the concrete and pounding curbs, pounding it, breaking up all, and handing these big chunks of concrete to people. And they were taking that concrete, going up on bridges and dropping it into the roof of a car. They were throwing it at our police. They were throwing it at our soldiers. If we didn't get involved, right now, Los Angeles would be burning, just like it was burning a number of months ago with all the houses that were lost. Los Angeles right now would be on fire.
U.S. President Donald Trump there digging in on his military response to protesters in Los Angeles. Law enforcement and demonstrators have clashed since Friday against the backdrop of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. There are now more than 4,100 members of the National Guard and about 700 Marines deployed to the Los Angeles area. The mayor of that city is not in favor of the deployment, and here's what she said in response.
On Thursday of last week, Los Angeles was peaceful. There was nothing going on here that warranted the federal intervention that took place the very next day. When the administration started, they said that this was about crime. They were going to go after violent felons, drug dealers, and I don't know how that matches with the scenes that we saw of people in Home Depot running through the parking lot because they were afraid that they were going to get arrested.
For more on what could be driving President Trump's move to deploy the troops to Los Angeles, I spoke with John Bolton. He was Trump's national security advisor during his first term and also served as ambassador to the UN under President George W. Bush. Hi, Ambassador Bolton. Pleasure to welcome you back to the program. Thank you very much for making the time.
Glad to be with you.
I have a number of questions about Canada-U.S. relations and defense spending in particular, but I did want to start on the situation in California because the images are certainly very prolific at this point. What, in your estimation, is motivating the president's decision to send in the National Guard and now the Marines as well?
Well, I think primarily he was looking for a political fight because he thinks it will benefit him with his base. Conservatives in America believe in federalism. They think that responsibility should be carried out by the lowest level of government possible, closest to the people. So in law enforcement matters, normally that means the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, the governor of California, with the federal government intervening only as a last resort. Obviously, that's not the way Trump approached it. So he's not following conservative principles here. He's doing this for political reasons.
Is he getting the political fight that you say he wants?
Yes, and I think Governor Newsom and the mayor of Los Angeles have kind of taken his bait and risen to the fight, which may benefit them politically as well. I mean, this could be a circumstance where the principal protagonists are benefited politically, but the country itself is not.
And what do you think the potential ramifications of that are?
Well, I think it's going to lead to more partisanship and division inside the country, and I think Trump will be the primary beneficiary of it because most Americans really don't believe you should come into the country illegally, and that's how this is going to be portrayed. And
just very quickly, is the desire for a political fight on Trump's part about distracting from other controversies he finds himself in, particularly around, for example, Elon Musk?
Oh, I think that's right. I think Trump is a master at shifting people's attention away from one problem by creating another somewhere else, and this has proven to be very timely from that perspective.
So I want to ask, as I promised, about Canada-U.S. because there are a number of developments on that front here. And in particular, I have to say, like, behind the scenes here in Ottawa, the speculation is rampant that some sort of trade arrangement, economic and security arrangement with the U.S., with Donald Trump, this White House, is going to be announced imminently, like in the coming days, perhaps in the coming weeks ahead of the G7. It felt like yesterday's announcement from the federal government to increase defense spending to finally hit that NATO target this year, 5 years ahead of schedule, is part and parcel of that. Do you think that kind of a promise is necessary in order to get some kind of deal with the White House?
Well, I've heard similar speculation, and you know, it's probably worth what you paid for it. It is a sore point for many Americans, not just Donald Trump, that going back to Barack Obama, who called NATO allies who didn't hit the 2% target free riders. So I think it's important to do. I think it's important for all of our defenses to move it up, and if that's part of a deal. You know, that I could see that coming. But remember, Trump has also said that defense spending should rise to 5% of gross domestic product. So everybody, including the United States, has still got a long way to go.
On the prospect of a so-called deal with Donald Trump, I think from what Canadians have been saying to me, viewers have been saying to me, like the primary question they have is how much can you trust one at this point, considering, as you know, there's a trade arrangement in place, a free trade agreement that these tariffs, the imposition of these tariffs have now contravened on multiple instances. Do you think a so-called deal with Donald Trump in the way we traditionally understand a deal is possible?
No, I think that is a risk. I think what Trump wants more than anything else is to be able to announce that he's got a deal that solves the problem. Now, whether it does or not is anybody's guess. You know, he announced with great fanfare about a month ago now, I think, a trade deal with the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. But that trade deal has still not been implemented. The tariff rates today are the same as they were the day he announced that. So a lot depends on whether this agreement is a 3-page memorandum of understanding, or really it turns out to be a very detailed fixing of the problem that Trump himself caused. So that's one reason I think it's premature, based on the speculation, to break out the champagne. I think there could still be a long way to go.
And you frequently also in our conversations referenced sort of the, I guess, justification or the rationale that Trump has behind the imposition of tariffs, and reminded us that it's not something he's often wavered from. Like, is there a world in which, it doesn't feel like there is, I should say, a world in which all of a sudden he says, you know what, no tariffs on Canada because we have some sort of arrangement?
Yeah, that I feel pretty comfortable saying is never going to happen. Right. I mean, it is also important to note that there's litigation going on in the United States that questions the legal basis of many of the significant tariffs that Trump has put into place, again, since he took office. And that could have a very profound impact. Canada would have to look at what that balance might be, because rushing to a deal before that is finally resolved in the Supreme Court could make a big difference.
The president will also be in attendance at the G7 next week, which will take place in Canada. You were at the last one with President Trump that took place in Canada. We've spoken about your writing on that and sort of the pretty events, at least from a Canadian perspective, that occurred between then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and President Trump during that meeting. What do you think, or how important do you think this series of meetings next week will be?
Well, I think it's interesting. It's being held in Kananaskis. I was at that G7 meeting too, and that went quite well. We developed a Canadian-U.S. idea to stop international trafficking in weapons and materials of mass destruction. Worked really the way a G7 should. I think this is going to be a test of the personal relationship between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump. As I've said before, Trump didn't like Justin Trudeau, and that is, in effect, sums up his view of U.S.-Canada relations during the period that Trudeau was in power. He seems to be off to a better start with Mark Carney. We'll see if that can continue through this G7 summit. That would be a good outcome if it were sustained.
The countries that are in attendance, many of them, vis-a-vis the imposition of tariffs and the sort of change in posture under President Trump of the United States from a foreign policy perspective, have talked more about relying less. Our own Prime Minister has said the relationship as we knew it, particularly around economic interdependence, is over. Do you think that kind of discussion that is happening among allies will make things awkward, given that the person they're talking about, the country they're talking about, is a part and parcel of these meetings?
Well, I think it's a mistake to think that these tariffs are going to be lasting, or that what Trump is doing reflects a real redirection of American policy. I think this is aberrational behavior. I don't think people who voted for Trump in the November 2024 election realized this was what they were voting for. I think as people see the impact of the tariffs, they grow ever more unpopular in the United States. And I think drawing conclusions about the next 100 years based on a 4-year term by Donald Trump is a big mistake for everybody.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. I'm out of time. I appreciate your time as always. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thanks for having me.
He knows where to find me. But you know what? Let your hands off 4-year-old girls that are trying to get educated. Let your hands off these poor people. They're just trying to live their lives, man. Trying to live their lives, paying their taxes, been here 10 years. The fear, the horror. The hell is this guy? Come after me, arrest me. Let's just get it over with. Tough guy.
Just a little bit there of the governor of California speaking to MSNBC a little bit earlier this week in reference to the first part of our conversation with Ambassador John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Donald Trump. Still a lot more to come on that story, the deployment of thousands of members of the National Guard to California, contrary to the wishes of the governor of the state, as well as the mayor of Los Angeles. We'll share any updates on that throughout the evening as they become available to us. Right now, though, I'm going to take a quick break here on Power Play. We'll turn back to domestic news after the break with our front bench. There they are, Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. We've got a lot to talk about when it comes to value for your taxpayer dollars. Back in a moment to talk about that.
This two-person basement dwelling company feasted on 64 million taxpayer dollars. This was a direct gift from the Liberal government who allowed basic procurement rules to be completely ignored over the last 10 years.
GC strategy has been prohibited from government contracts for 7 years. As a member of Canada's new government and a new member of Parliament, we will uphold higher standards, Mr. Speaker.
How about spend less on your insider friends and invest more in clawing back the money from GC Strategies?
As of last year, GC Strategies has seen its contracts terminated by the Government of Canada, and we've revoked their security clearance.
Prime Minister Mark Carney and his new Minister of Procurement, Joel Lightbound, there defending nearly a decade of procurement mismanagement. That's according to the Auditor General, who investigated 106 contracts awarded to the firm GC Strategies from 2015 until 2024. She found that the government failed in many cases to follow its own procurement rules. For a brief refresher, that's the company behind the beleaguered COVID-era border control app, ArriveCan. That was a project originally billed at $80,000. It wound up costing 60 million taxpayer dollars. Are the feds now doing enough to ensure value for your money? Let's talk about that with the front bench. With me tonight, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is here. He's a senior advisor with Edelman. CTV News political analyst and former leader of the federal NDP, Tom Mulcair, is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief, Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Great to see you. The funniest clip today, I think, Tom, was from the leader of the Conservatives outside the House, Pierre Poilievre, when he said, described the Auditor General's reports today as an orgy of Liberal waste. How much cover does the Mark Carney government have in describing itself as a new government and sort of ensuring that this doesn't continue?
There was a choice of words there that I found interesting by Carney, and he hasn't done it often, but there have been moments when he's had to distance himself clearly from what was chronic mismanagement, especially on the economic side by the Trudeau government. And he simply said, this is a new government. We're not going to work that way. We're going to be responsible and we'll follow the rules. There's not much else he can say. But several times now he's thrown the previous administration under the bus. I guess it would help his case a little bit if there weren't so many people from that previous administration sitting around his cabinet table. But I think that overall Canadians are buying it. I think that Carney is being given that as part of his honeymoon package. We'll see whether it lasts into the fall.
Yeah, it certainly is, James, I think, a message that we've heard on occasion from the Prime Minister in trying to delineate himself from the previous government. One of the big areas is around government spending. And he's invoked, talk of responsibility and sort of being more restrained on a number of occasions throughout the campaign. And even since, why do you think that is, and will it work?
Like this, that are very easy to understand, right? Oh, can you hear me all right?
Sorry, start again if you don't mind. You were on mute.
Sure. I was going to say, it's boutique examples like this that the public genuinely understands, right? More than 100 contracts spanning close to a decade for, frankly, a piece of software that ChatGPT probably could have spat out inside of about 20 minutes. And so, Canadians really understand this. And to Tom's point, for a lot of Canadians, policy is personnel. And so the ability of this Prime Minister to say, this is a new government, I'm a new Prime Minister, and we are changing the ways from the past. It's a good line. It's a holding line. It has purchase right now. But in the fullness of time, if you still have the same personalities and cabinet ministers standing up and saying, we've learned from the past, well, it's hard to divorce the past from the people who were there in the past, who are the authors of the policy that got us into this mess. So it's going to be a challenge. And then when you get to larger ticket items like the F-35 or an increase in defense spending or trusting the same hands with large-scale procurement with really sensitive environmental, indigenous, and nation-building components that we're planning on doing in the next little while, there's an element of trust here that I think Prime Minister Carney as a person has, but he should not risk losing that political capital and trust with the public by surrounding himself with people who are defending the indefensible policies and approaches of the past.
The F-35 report done by the AG is also really interesting, Rob, insofar as she really clearly lays out that it's not just the costs which have ballooned, but maybe even more significantly, we are not set up at this point, nor do we even have a plan at this point to make sure that pilots are trained to operate them should they start arriving in 2028. And she described it as all of the stuff national defense is doing around this is very reactive and not proactive, which is ironic almost against the backdrop of yesterday's big announcement, which was we're going to spend a whole lot more and do a whole lot more.
Exactly, Vashi. I mean, it's great we're buying new fighter jets, even though the price, we were told a price that was already wrong when we were told it, as she explained in her report today. It's inflated by, 50% more than we thought it was going to be, and we don't have enough pilots trained to fly these Lightning IIs, the new fighters. So and Tom knows this. He was a very effective leader of the opposition. Auditor General Day is the best day to be an opposition leader. It's the worst day in government because it's boondoggle after boondoggle. And I think that Carney can legitimately say he's new, he wasn't there at the time, but that is going to wear thin pretty quickly. I thought he had almost like a Cheshire Cat grin today when he was taking questions on the report, basically saying how things have changed now that I'm here. Having said all that, if this were sticky, Justin Trudeau wouldn't be getting reelected. And Justin Trudeau is ancient history, so this isn't going to be sticky. It's unfortunately for the Conservatives, who would have been the main beneficiaries of a report like this traditionally. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's sticky.
I think the grin that Rob is referencing, Brian, is exactly the clip we played where the Prime Minister, again, and he does this on occasion in question period, talk about the new government, right? So you have opposition who are, pointing out things like today's Auditor General's report, which is significantly damning of the actions of people around the cabinet table and the former Prime Minister and the former government. And the reply is most frequently, hey, it's the new government. So my question is sort of similar as it was to your colleagues, how long does that actually land?
Yeah, I prescribe to what Benzie said. I think that it does work. I think that Canadians see a new leader, a new Prime Minister, and they put a lot of attention, not just in the last little while, but I think they've done this for a long time. They put a lot of attention, a lot of sort of chips on who the leader and the Prime Minister is, or the Premier at the provincial level. So my sense would be that it probably will be a good holding line, as James called it. It will be one in which people will say, yeah, okay, fair enough. But I think the real test, as Benzie pointed out, it'll be over time. And if he kind of cleans up this type of thing, and there's not many of them, or hopefully for Canadians' sake, none at all, then I think people will say, yep, it wasn't just a holding line. It is a new government. They changed. They delivered. If they don't, and if there are similar things, then I think it becomes pretty complicated. So although I think the Conservatives don't get the bang out of their buck that they would want today, they are potentially setting up that if there are issues like this that continue to happen, that they're going to be able to sort of start to point to a trail of things that have happened under his watch, and then connect it to the previous government and say, look, it's all sort of the same. So point that I'm getting at, I think the sort of grin is most likely. I didn't watch question period, but my guess is that it's most likely because he knows that sort of irritates the Conservatives when he uses that line. But using that is a fair point that Canadians will accept, I think, as long as he really does indeed kind of clean things up and we don't see these types of issues moving forward under his government.
Do you think, more generally speaking, in particular, like I think to be fair to the government, they have made announcements like the defense one yesterday that, does contrast them to the previous government. Do you think, Tom, though, that like that fall budget will ultimately be the proof point that sort of does away with a lot of the benefit of the doubt that they've been awarded?
Absolutely. I think the fall session is going to be the time for the new government to start assuming its role fully and stop trying to roll back on what happened before and just saying, oh, that wasn't us, that was some other gang who happened to be around the cabinet table. With regard to the government spending on defense, which was announced yesterday to get us to the 2% that is we agreed to as the minimum expenditure of 2% of GDP to be part of NATO, well, the Auditor General's report really helps in that direction because the money that we're going to be spending on these fighters is a lot more. The other thing that's on the table, everybody's correctly interpreted this as being an attempt by Canada to make sure we can answer some of the critiques of Trump, and Trump can crow some sort of victory saying, oh, Canada's going to be paying more on defense. But at the same time, as Carney is starting to show more and more impatience with Trump and perhaps getting ready for his own round of counter tariffs, it's worth bearing in mind that the total cost, if you look at all that has to be spent, the billions and the billions to redo Cold Lake and Bagotville, the two bases where they'll be located, when you look at the massive contract for maintenance over the years, you're looking at about $100 billion. And so that's a lot of money for the American company that's in the running right now for this, for the F-35. And I think that we've got to be ready to start saying, you know what, there are things called Rafales and there are Sabs and there are Eurofighters. They all have two engines, miraculously, and the Lightning II only has one engine. Good luck with that over the Arctic. So I think that Canada has an argument that could be made against this boondoggle. If it's the only thing that's left in the room, we can say, no, there are other options.
I feel like the problem, at least from a political perspective with that is, James, that we've already spent a sum of that money and a significant amount of it, not nearly $100 billion. But the second part is, a few weeks ago, we had the U.S. ambassador on this program who basically said, if we don't buy those, say goodbye to NORAD.
Yeah, I mean, that's a step too far, but whatever. That's the nature of politics these days. But look, there is a sunken cost here. It would be a bit of a jiu-jitsu move for the government to say, hey, we were spending $19 billion, now we're up to $27 billion. So, there you go, closer to 2%. We're on our way. I don't think they'll quite be. I don't think they'll be quite that cute. But you can see that interoperability and alignment technologically wise with the United States and with our NORAD and NATO partners is obviously a benefit of the F-35 program, broadly speaking. The economic benefits for the aerospace sector in Canada, there is a benefit to be said there. The single engine in the Arctic is a concern that has been raised by many, including the late Mark Garneau when he was critic of this project for a long time. But the Liberals really do own this, right? I mean, they got elected in 2015, Tom will remember, being very definitive in saying the F-35 will never happen. Then they got elected and they went into the F-35 and they said, but it will be on budget and on time. It's not on budget, it's not on time. Then now you have this imperative to align our interests on not only the 2%, but the interoperability of technology with the United States as part of the pathway to get towards rapprochement with the Trump administration on the trade files, the security files, the border files, and all that. So this is now a spoke in a bigger wheel of Canada-U.S. relations that goes beyond the uniqueness of this technology and what it means for Canada's defense capacity. So, I think there's just so much momentum behind this that it's not something we're going to turn around. Having more diversity in our air capacity, though, is something that the government of Canada will have to think about in the out years, though.
Okay, I've got to take a quick commercial break. The front bench will be back on the other end of that break. More Power Play just ahead.
Is Canada trying to normalize relations with India?
As the Prime Minister has said, there is a law enforcement to law enforcement dialogue that is occurring between those two countries. In addition, as host of the G7, Canada is hosting global leaders for a global conversation about numerous issues: energy security, peace and stability, and trade routes for all members who are attending.
But
And it is therefore important for all countries who are being invited to be at the table.
Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand today asked there if Canada is trying to normalize relations with India. Prime Minister Mark Carney has invited Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, despite an allegation from former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that the Modi government was behind the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince has also been invited, despite significant human rights concerns in that country. How does the Prime Minister square the circle, both domestically and internationally? Let's talk about that with our front bench. They're back. Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. Brian, I'll start with you. What do you think the impetus is behind these invites, and how much political capital does the Prime Minister have to expend on them?
So everything I'm about to say, I guess this is what we do every week, is really just sort of speculating, trying to read between the lines and trying to get a sense of the Prime Minister, the government, and their approach. I mean, my sense would be this. I think that the Prime Minister and his team see themselves as being elected and having a mandate to focus on ensuring that Canadians feel better about the economy, to see economic growth, and to see Canadians' financial situation improve. I think that they believe that that is the main reason that they're the government, and that is what Canadians are going to expect of them over the next few years. And to my sense is that they are sort of just going at that and pushing other considerations aside. Frankly, it could also be that that is just the Prime Minister's focus as well, and that is his priority. But the way in which the sort of campaign unfolded, the timing of everything happening with trade, the trade conflict with the U.S., that is my sense that this government thinks that that is the only priority. So if you take that, it's a guess, it's speculation, but if you take that as truth, then it makes sense to say we're going to invite global leaders to discuss, as the minister was sort of pointing to, trade and how we're going to ensure economic prosperity, and you kind of put all the other considerations aside. Look, I think that there's probably a moment right now where a lot of people feel that the economy has to be the absolute priority. But sort of like we were discussing in the first segment, some of that can come to roost at one point, right? There are other things that people care deeply about. So at one point, you have to be careful from a political point of view and a domestic influence of your foreign policy on the sort of political landscape, that you brush aside other considerations that are incredibly important to Canadians and to parts of Canada, that you put that aside just because you think the only thing you need to do is grow the economy. So for now, I think it'll probably be accepted somewhat because of sort of the way in which this government came to power, but time will tell if it will be the right approach.
Benzie, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it suggests to me that the Prime Minister of Canada's new government lives in the real world, not in a perfect world where we can only deal with people who are wholly like-minded. I don't love MBS as a journalist. I certainly don't love MBS after what happened to Khashoggi in the embassy in Turkey. But I think it suggests to me that Carney is trying to look outward. Remember, he's also invited Claudia Sheinbaum from Mexico, Anthony Albanese from Australia. So it's not just a rogues gallery of extra guests. I think politically it is important. Narendra Modi is an important world figure. 1 in 25 Canadians is from the Indian diaspora. So that is a huge domestic thing. Obviously, half of those are Sikhs and half are Hindu. So there's certainly a complicated equation politically for Mr. Carney to navigate here at home domestically on Modi's presence. Yeah. But India is an important market for Canadian goods. I've been on trade missions with politicians to India, and we are a very important provider of everything for them, food, services, and so on. So I think he suggests that Carney is living in the real world, not the perfect world.
And I certainly get that, particularly about the other invitees. In the Indian case, though, I mean, the allegation coming from the Liberal government, James, was very specific. It was direct about, the Canada-India relationship. It was accusing that government of being behind a murder. It wasn't just like, oh, you've done other bad things to other people.
Yeah, and I gather, look, that's being litigated, but I agree with Rob's broad point, though, there, right? Which is that it's a complicated world. complicated actors, and the dynamics in which Canada operates as the host of the G7 conference, and plus these invited guests as well, is one where the Prime Minister has an obligation to look onto the horizon and to look 5 years, 10 years into the future. It wasn't that long ago, for example, with Saudi Arabia, that we were talking about full-blown rapprochement and a détente between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which would have had a tectonic shift on the balance of power in the Middle East, given that Saudi Arabia's sort of long-time antagonism towards Iran and the proxy wars that have been happening in that region. Now, that was put on hold after the October attacks, the push into Gaza by Benjamin Netanyahu and sort of the unpopularity of Mr. Netanyahu and what that's meant to that relationship. But you can imagine 2 years from now, 5 years from now, that could be reanimated and what that would mean for Canada, what that would mean for the world. With regards to India, yes, obviously a horrific event if true. It'll be litigated. Hopefully there'll be some transparency and people who are aligned with that will be held appropriately accountable. But this is the largest democracy in the world. Canada has enormous economic opportunities, and also the dynamic in Kashmir is something that Canada has to be very concerned about and the world has to be very concerned about. And that's obviously an immediate concern now and will continue to be for the next 5 years. So, we can talk about President Trump and what's going on in California. We can talk about a lot of things that are happening around the world, and we can get, bound up in today's anxieties and frustrations and controversies. But part of the purpose of the G7 is to cast your eye further into the horizon, see where the puck is going and skate in that direction, and triage Canada's interests with a longer lens on things. And I think that's what the Prime Minister is doing with these invitations, and I think that's appropriate for the moment.
The last word to you, Tom, and my apologies in advance. I'm up against the commercial, so I've only got about 30 seconds.
Well, I tend to agree with what James just said. I think that Trump is the backdrop of all of this, and Canada is in a unique position at this particular G7 meeting, Vashi, which is the 50th since it was established. Mark Carney has a lot of credibility on all of these economic issues, and we can't have an Indo-Pacific treaty and not be working with India. The Americans dealt with a very similar situation, by the way, of interference by the Indian government. They dealt with it in the normal way. Trudeau stood up on the first day of Parliament and blew it up. And this is the difference. I think that Carney is trying to establish that we can have partnerships with Europeans, with our NATO allies. We can have partnerships in the Pacific. We can work with other countries, including inviting China, despite the fact that we went through a whole issue involving foreign interference there. So I think that overall it's Carney being Carney. And I think that at the end of this G7 meeting, I think we'll be in a position to judge him a lot better. But I think this is going to be an opportunity for Canada to shine, thanks to the role that he's played in the world before and that Canada can start playing, because the era of Trump is upsetting everything in the economic world, especially our trade relationships.
Okay, I got to leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. Happy birthday, James. We'll take a quick break. Back with more in a moment. Welcome back to Power Play. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has just issued a statement condemning actions by Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway today to impose sanctions on two far-right Israeli cabinet ministers for, quote-unquote, inciting violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. Secretary Rubio says these sanctions do not advance U.S.-led efforts to achieve a ceasefire, bring all hostages home, and end the war. We reject any notion of equivalence, he goes on to say. Hamas is a terrorist organization that committed unspeakable atrocities. We remind our partners not to forget who the real enemy is. I'll leave Power Play there. I'm Vashi Kaplos. Have a great night.